The air in the Washington conference room was scrubbed clean, devoid of any scent or warmth. The U.S. official pushed a single document across the polished surface of the table. It slid until it stopped inches from the hands of the Taiwan envoy. The header was printed in bold, "Status Quo Preservation." The U.S. official leaned back, his chair creaking once in the quiet. He waited. The Taiwan envoy did not look down at the paper. He did not reach for it. He kept his hands flat on the table, fingers spread, pinning the silence between them. The document sat untouched, a white island on the dark wood. The U.S. official tapped his fingers against his watch, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the stillness. He looked up, his expression unreadable, waiting for a response that refused to come. The envoy finally shifted his gaze from the wall to the official, his posture rigid. He did not speak, but his refusal to acknowledge the paper spoke for him. The negotiation had already fractured before the first word was uttered. Every second the document remained unread, the tension in the room thickened, turning the sterile office into a pressure chamber. The U.S. official cleared his throat. He spoke of restraint, of a necessary cool-down period, to prevent a direct collision with Beijing. His voice was measured, designed to de-escalate. He expected a standard diplomatic rebuttal. Instead, the Taiwan envoy leaned forward and tapped his knuckles against the mahogany. The sound was dry and heavy. He did not talk about borders or sovereignty. He talked about silicon. He laid out the hard reality of the foundries in Hsinchu. He listed the production capacity of the wafers that fed the global economy. The official tried to steer the conversation back to the document on the table, but the envoy interrupted. He explained that a single hour of disruption in his territory would halt assembly lines in Detroit, Tokyo, and Berlin. The envoy's words stripped away the diplomatic veneer. He forced the official to see the room not as a space for policy, but as a node in a fragile global network. The official stopped checking his watch. He looked at the envoy's hands, then at the empty space on the table, realizing that the leverage had fundamentally shifted from the paper to the machines. The envoy did not answer the call for restraint. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a tightly folded map. He dropped it onto the mahogany table. The paper unfolded with a sharp, dry snap, sliding across the surface until it completely obscured the U.S. official's document. The envoy pressed his palm firmly onto the center of the print. He pointed to the narrow strip of water separating the island from the continent. The U.S. official looked down, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of the coastline. The envoy did not speak of diplomacy. He spoke of depth, of sea lanes, and of the physical distance required for a fleet to cross. He explained that what Washington labeled as a need for a cool-down was, to those in Taipei, a fundamental misunderstanding of their daily existence. He traced the Strait with his index finger, showing the official exactly where the pressure was being applied. Every movement of his hand was precise, turning the abstract political concept into a tangible, high-stakes geography of survival. The room grew colder as the official leaned in, his eyes fixed on the map, finally forced to acknowledge the physical vulnerability of the nodes he had spent the last hour trying to manage. The envoy retracted his finger from the map and sat back, his gaze locking onto the official. He addressed the accusation of provocation with a sharp, dismissive shake of his head. He argued that labeling their existence as a new act was a convenient fiction maintained by Beijing to justify aggression. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping into a low, steady rhythm. He insisted that what the official called independence was not a political maneuver, but an existing, daily reality that had functioned for decades. The U.S. official reached for his folder, attempting to cite a specific protocol regarding unilateral changes, but his hand hovered over the table, hesitant. The envoy did not let him finish. He closed his briefcase with a loud, final click that echoed through the room, cutting off the official's attempt to revert to the old framework. The envoy stated that ignoring this reality was the path to total collapse. The official looked at the closed briefcase, then back at the envoy, visibly struggling to reconcile his scripted talking points with the blunt, undeniable facts being presented. The room felt suddenly smaller, the distance between the two men shrinking as the official's diplomatic safety net began to fray under the pressure of the envoy's uncompromising logic. The U.S. official straightened his tie, the silence in the room heavy and artificial. He pressed his palms flat against the mahogany, demanding specific, written assurances that no unilateral moves would originate from Taipei. He spoke of the need for a guarantee of calm, his voice calibrated for a press release rather than a negotiation. The envoy did not blink. He waited for the official to finish, then countered with a single, sharp question. He asked what concrete security guarantees the U.S. provided for the world's most advanced chip foundries. The question hung in the air, stripping away the diplomatic gloss. The official hesitated, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, nervous beat against the table. The envoy leaned into the space between them, his presence filling the room. He reminded the official that these foundries were not just assets. They were the physical bedrock of the global economy. He demanded to know how the U.S. intended to protect the facilities that actually powered the modern world if they remained paralyzed by a fear of escalation. The air in the room grew thick, the walls seeming to press inward as the trade-offs of the current policy were laid bare. The official looked away, staring at the empty space on the table where the map had been, his previous script now entirely useless. The envoy gestured to the empty table, sketching an invisible network with his hands. He explained that every chip fabricated in Hsinchu acted as a vital node in a global architecture. He traced the logistics. A disruption in production would not just impact the island. Within 2 weeks, assembly lines in Detroit, Tokyo, and Berlin would go dark. The envoy listed the consequences with clinical precision, detailing the cascading failures of global manufacturing. The U.S. official's pen stopped mid-air. He looked up, his expression hardening as the implications of a total supply chain collapse registered. The room went unnervingly still. The weight of the global economy had suddenly materialized in the space between them, turning the air cold and dense. It was no longer a negotiation about diplomatic maneuvering. It was a matter of industrial life and death. The official stared at the table, his eyes reflecting the magnitude of the potential fallout. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to feel like a physical blow to the chest. The abstract concept of trade had vanished, replaced by the terrifying, concrete reality that the modern world was tethered to a single, fragile point of failure. The official did not speak, his breath shallow, his gaze fixed on the mahogany, as if the entire global market were crumbling right there on the wood. The envoy reached into his briefcase and withdrew a series of satellite plots, spreading them across the mahogany. These were not theoretical warnings. They were logs of naval exercises that had tightened like a noose around the island over the last 6 months. He tapped the paper, tracing the encroaching lines of gray zone tactics that pushed closer to the coast every single day. He looked directly at the U.S. official, his voice low and steady. You call this a status quo. I call it a slow-motion strangulation. The official remained silent, his gaze shifting from the maps to the window, refusing to engage with the data. The envoy slammed his hand down near the images, the sound cracking through the heavy air. He demanded to know how the West could justify the label of provocation when the pressure was external and constant. He painted a picture of a coastline under siege, where every flight path and every patrol was a calculated step toward total blockade. The official leaned back, his chair creaking, still offering no response. The envoy did not let him hide. He forced the conversation back to the reality of the water outside, where the silence of the room was being bought at the cost of his country's ability to breathe. The U.S. official finally broke his stillness. He glanced at his watch, a sharp, metallic flick of the wrist that signaled the end of patience. He did not look at the maps anymore. He looked at the window. Outside, the Washington skyline stood indifferent, a gray, immovable backdrop of stone and glass that felt a world away from the crisis unfolding on the table. The disconnect was absolute. Inside the room, The air was sharp with the scent of ozone and stale coffee, vibrating with a decision that could reset the global order. The debate narrowed to a binary point, stripped of all diplomatic padding. It was no longer about nuance or long-term strategy. It was a brutal choice between two paths. Either they chose active deterrence, risking a direct collision with a rising power, or they chose appeasement, hoping to buy time while the foundations of the world's economy were systematically dismantled. The official's eyes flicked back to the envoy, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid. Every second that ticked by on his watch felt like a countdown to a reality they could no longer control. The room had become a pressure cooker, and the choice was now binary. Protect the nodes of the modern world, or watch the slow, inevitable decline of an era. The envoy stood up. The movement was sudden, deliberate, and final. He began gathering his files, the rustle of paper loud in the stagnant air of the boardroom. He did not look for a reaction. He did not wait for an invitation. He looked down at the U.S. official, whose composure finally began to fray. The envoy pointed a finger at the center of the table, where the map of the Strait lay ignored. He spoke, his voice stripping away the remaining diplomatic veneer. If you only listen to the narrative coming from Beijing, you ignore the people who operate the machines that keep your world running. He stepped toward the door, then stopped. He turned back, his gaze locking onto the official. Tell me, do you want to secure the chips, or do you want to manage the decline? The question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable. The U.S. official remained in his chair, his hands frozen on the mahogany surface, staring at the map. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. The envoy stood still, waiting for an answer that he knew would not come. The room had reached its breaking point. Every word spoken had dismantled the status quo, leaving nothing but the raw, uncomfortable truth behind. The heavy door clicked shut, muffling the sound of footsteps retreating down the long, carpeted hall. The envoy did not look back. He strode past the security details stationed at the threshold, his pace steady, his mind already mapping the next phase of the crisis. Inside the conference room, the silence was total. The U.S. official remained seated, his hand resting on the edge of the mahogany table, inches away from the map of the Taiwan Strait. He did not move to gather his notes. He simply stared at the geography of the conflict, the lines of the sea routes, and the locations of the foundries marked in ink. The air still held the weight of the unanswered question. There was no handshake to seal a compromise, no diplomatic nod to signal a path forward. The room felt suddenly hollow, a sterile stage where the props of global power sat abandoned. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that the logic of the semiconductor supply chain had just shifted on its axis. The official finally leaned back, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the envoy had stood. The negotiation was not over. It had only just begun. The map remained on the table, a silent witness to the decision that would inevitably shape the coming decade.